The smell hit me first. Vanilla and lavender, Grace's signature scent, but mixed with something else. Something that didn't belong in our bedroom at 3 in the morning. I stood in the doorway, watching my wife of 12 years sleep peacefully in our king-sized bed, her blonde hair spread across the pillow like a halo. How fitting for the queen of our local Methodist church. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My name is Eddie Barrow, and I fix things for a living. Plumbing, electrical, carpentry, you name it, I can repair it. What I couldn't fix, apparently, was my marriage. The insomnia had been getting worse lately. Grace blamed it on my guilty conscience about missing too many Sunday services. She had no idea how right she was about the guilt part, just wrong about the source. I padded quietly to the bathroom, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors I'd installed myself 3 summers ago. That's when I saw it, a coffee mug in the sink that I didn't recognize. Expensive-looking ceramic with a lipstick stain that definitely wasn't Grace's usual coral pink. This was deep red, almost burgundy. Grace stirred behind me. "Eddie, what are you doing up?" "Just getting some water," I said, my voice steady. 20 years of dealing with difficult customers had taught me to keep my emotions in check. "Come back to bed. You know how cranky you get without sleep." I almost laughed. Cranky was the least of her worries. Instead of returning to bed, I made my way downstairs to my workshop in the garage. This was my sanctuary, pegboard walls lined with tools, a workbench scarred from countless projects, and the faint smell of sawdust and motor oil. It was the only place in the house that was purely mine. I fired up my laptop and opened our shared bank account. Grace handled most of the finances, claiming her HR management background made her more qualified. I'd been happy to let her, focusing instead on building my handyman business. Now I wondered what else I'd been happy to ignore. The statements told a story I didn't want to read. Charges at restaurants I'd never been to, hotels during her supposed church retreats, and a recurring payment to something called discretion communications. A quick Google search revealed it was a service that provided secondary phone numbers for privacy-conscious individuals. My hands weren't shaking yet, but they would be soon. I spent the next hour going through everything with the methodical precision I brought to rewiring a house or rebuilding an engine. By sunrise, I had a timeline that made my stomach turn. The affair had been going on for at least 6 months, maybe longer. Grace came down at 7, already dressed in one of her conservative business suits, her makeup perfect despite the early hour. "You look tired," she said, pouring herself coffee from the pot I'd made. "Maybe you should see Dr. Peterson about something to help you sleep." "Maybe I should," I agreed, watching her face for any sign of guilt or concern. There was nothing. Grace had always been good at compartmentalizing. "I'll be late tonight," she continued, checking her phone. "Bible study group is planning the spring fundraiser. We might grab dinner afterward." "Which restaurant?" The question was casual, but she paused for just a moment too long. "We haven't decided yet. Probably that new place downtown." I knew she was lying. The new place downtown had been closed for renovations all week. I'd driven past it yesterday on my way to a job. "Have fun," I said. After Grace left, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and staring out the window at our perfectly manicured lawn. We lived in Millbrook, Maine, the kind of small town where everybody knew everybody else's business, or thought they did. Grace had worked hard to cultivate our image as the perfect Christian couple. She was active in church committees, organized charity drives, and never missed an opportunity to post inspirational quotes on social media. I was the supportive husband who showed up when needed, but mostly stayed in the background. The quiet guy who fixed things and didn't ask too many questions. It was a role I'd grown comfortable with over the years. That comfort was about to end. My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. Frank Morrison's name appeared on the screen. "Eddie, you busy this morning?" Mrs. Patterson's water heater died again. Frank owned Morrison's auto repair and threw work my way when people needed more than just car fixes. He was also one of the few people in town I considered a real friend. "I'll be right over," I said. Work would be a good distraction while I figured out my next move. Mrs. Patterson's house was a 15-minute drive through Millbrook's tree-lined streets. The town looked like something from a postcard: white picket fences, American flags, and churches on every other corner. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. I was about to find out how much that trust was worth. Mrs. Patterson was waiting on her front porch when I pulled into her driveway. She was somewhere north of 70, with silver hair and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that came from raising 6 kids and burying 2 husbands. "That damn thing is making noises like a dying cat," she said without preamble. "And before you ask, yes, I tried jiggling the handle like you showed me last time." I couldn't help but smile. Mrs. Patterson had a way of cutting through the bullshit that I'd always appreciated. "Let's take a look," I said, grabbing my toolbox from the truck. The water heater was indeed on its last legs. While I worked, Mrs. Patterson kept me company with a steady stream of local gossip. Normally, I tuned most of it out, but today I found myself listening more carefully. "Speaking of marriages," she said, apropos of nothing, "I saw Grace having lunch at Romano's yesterday. That new fellow was with her, Derek something. He's been sniffing around all the church ladies lately." My wrench slipped, and I scraped my knuckles against the pipe. "Derek?" "Derek Owens. Moved here about 8 months ago from Portland. Runs that new real estate office on Main Street. Divorced, of course. They always are." 8 months. Right around the time Grace started working late more often. "He seems nice enough," Mrs. Patterson continued, "but there's something about him that rubs me wrong. Too smooth, if you know what I mean. Like a used car salesman trying to sell you a lemon." I finished the repair in record time, my mind racing. Derek Owens. I'd heard the name before. Grace had mentioned him in passing as someone from church who was helping with property assessments for the building fund. "Thanks for the heads up about Romano's," I said as I packed up my tools. "I might surprise Grace with lunch there sometime." Mrs. Patterson gave me a look that suggested she knew exactly what kind of surprise I had in mind. "You're a good man, Eddie Barrow. Don't let anyone tell you different." Instead of heading home, I drove to the center of town and parked across from Romano's Italian restaurant. It was the kind of upscale place that Grace and I went to maybe twice a year, usually for anniversaries or birthdays. Not the kind of spot for casual church committee meetings. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly noon, Grace's silver Honda pulled into the parking lot. She sat in the car for a few minutes, checking her makeup in the rearview mirror. Then Derek Owens emerged from a black BMW parked 2 spaces away. He was everything I wasn't. Tall, tan, with the kind of expensive haircut that cost more than I made in a day. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my truck payment, and when he smiled, I could see the gleam of perfect white teeth from across the street. They didn't go into the restaurant together. Grace went first, and Derek followed about 2 minutes later. Amateur hour. In a town like Millbrook, someone was bound to notice eventually. I waited another hour, watching through the restaurant's front windows. They sat at a corner table, leaning close together like lovers sharing secrets. Grace laughed at something Derek said, touching his arm in a way she hadn't touched me in months. When they finally emerged, the pretense was dropped entirely. Derek's hand was on the small of Grace's back as he walked her to her car. They kissed, not a peck on the cheek between church friends, but a full, passionate embrace that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. I sat in my truck for another 10 minutes after they left, letting the reality sink in. My wife was having an affair, and she wasn't even trying very hard to hide it. The only reason I hadn't discovered it sooner was because I'd trusted her completely. That trust was now officially dead and buried. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Meeting running long, don't wait up for dinner." I typed back, "No problem. Love you." The lie tasted bitter, but it was necessary. I needed time to plan my next move, and that meant keeping Grace in the dark about what I knew. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching Derek Owens. Social media made it embarrassingly easy. His Facebook page was full of photos from expensive restaurants, weekend trips to Boston, and selfies that screamed midlife crisis. He'd been divorced for 2 years, and based on his ex-wife's carefully worded posts, the split hadn't been amicable. More interesting was his business. Owens Real Estate had opened with great fanfare, promising to bring big city expertise to small town values. The website was slick and professional, but a quick check with the Better Business Bureau revealed several complaints about misleading listings and hidden fees. Derek Owens was a con man with a real estate license, and my wife was his latest mark. That evening, I sat in my workshop pretending to organize tools while actually planning my revenge. I'd never been the type to fly off the handle or make rash decisions. When a job required delicate work, I took my time and did it right. This situation would be no different. Grace came home at nearly 10 o'clock, full of apologies and explanations about the fundraiser committee running late. She smelled like wine and expensive cologne, definitely not the church basement meeting she'd described. "How was your day?" she asked, kissing my cheek with lips that had probably been on Derek's mouth hours earlier. "Same as always," I said. "Fixed Mrs. Patterson's water heater, did some paperwork, watched TV." "You should get out more," Grace said, already heading upstairs. "Maybe join one of the men's groups at church. Pastor Glenn is always asking about you." I almost laughed. Pastor Glenn was about to get more involved in our marriage than he'd ever bargained for. "Maybe I will," I called after her. That night, I lay in bed listening to Grace's steady breathing and planning phase 1 of my revenge. It would start with the church, Grace's precious sanctuary where she'd built her reputation as the perfect Christian wife. If she wanted to play games with her marriage vows, I'd make sure the whole congregation got to watch. But first, I needed more evidence, and I knew exactly where to find it. The next morning, Grace left for work at her usual time, but not before spending 20 minutes on her phone in the bathroom with the door locked. When she finally emerged, she was practically glowing. "Big day at the office," she announced, straightening her skirt in the hallway mirror. "We're interviewing candidates for the new regional manager position." "Sounds important," I said, not looking up from my coffee. "It is. I might be late again tonight. We're taking the candidates out for dinner to get a better sense of their personalities." Another lie, delivered with the same practiced ease as all the others. I wondered how long she'd been perfecting this skill. After Grace left, I called Frank and told him I needed to take a personal day. Then I drove to Derek's office on Main Street. Owens Real Estate occupied a narrow storefront between a used bookstore and a shop that sold handmade crafts to tourists. Through the window, I could see Derek at his desk, talking animatedly on the phone. He gestured with his free hand like he was conducting an orchestra, his face animated with the kind of enthusiasm that probably sold a lot of overpriced houses to unsuspecting buyers. I parked across the street and settled in to watch. Surveillance wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. I needed to understand Derek's routine, his habits, his weaknesses. Everyone had them. You just had to know where to look. Around 10:30, Derek emerged from his office and walked 2 blocks to Millbrook Coffee, the local cafe where half the town conducted their daily business over lattes and gossip. I followed at a distance, taking care to stay out of sight. The cafe was busy with the usual morning crowd, retirees reading newspapers, mothers with strollers, and business people grabbing coffee between appointments. Derek ordered something complicated that required the barista to use 3 different syrups, then took a seat at a table near the window. He wasn't alone for long. Sandy Mitchell slid into the chair across from him, her face flushed with excitement. Sandy was Grace's best friend and fellow church committee member, a thin, nervous woman who seemed to live vicariously through other people's drama. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I sat, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. Sandy was leaning forward, speaking in urgent whispers, while Derek nodded and smiled. At one point, she pulled out her phone and showed him something that made him laugh. They were discussing Grace. I was sure of it. After 20 minutes, Sandy left, but not before squeezing Derek's hand in what looked like a gesture of support or encouragement. Derek watched her go, then pulled out his own phone and typed a quick message. My phone buzzed 30 seconds later with a text from Grace. "Thinking about you." The pieces were falling into place. Sandy wasn't just aware of the affair. She was actively facilitating it, probably feeding Derek information about Grace's schedule and my whereabouts. In a twisted way, I almost admired the coordination. It took real effort to orchestrate this level of deception. I followed Derek back to his office, then drove home to begin phase 1 of my plan. If Grace wanted to play games, I'd show her how a professional handled strategy. My first stop was Pastor Glenn's office at Millbrook Methodist. The church was a beautiful old building with white clapboard siding and a bell tower that had been calling the faithful to worship for over a century. Grace loved everything about it: the history, the tradition, the sense of community it represented. She was about to learn that communities could turn on you just as quickly as they embraced you. Pastor Glenn was in his 50s, with thinning hair and the soft build of a man who spent more time at potluck dinners than at the gym. He was a good man, genuinely caring about his congregation, but he was also human, and humans, in my experience, were always interested in a good story. "Eddie," he said, rising from behind his desk to shake my hand. "What a pleasant surprise. Grace mentioned you might be interested in joining one of our men's groups." "That's actually why I'm here," I said, taking the chair he offered. "I've been doing some soul-searching lately, and I think it's time I became more involved in the church community." Pastor Glenn's face lit up like I'd just told him Christmas was coming early. "That's wonderful news. I've always believed that a strong marriage is built on a foundation of shared faith." "About that," I said, allowing a note of concern to creep into my voice. "I'm a little worried about Grace lately. She's been working so much, staying out late for church meetings. I'm starting to feel like we're drifting apart." "Marriage goes through seasons," Pastor Glenn said, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes couples need to rediscover what brought them together in the first place." "You're probably right," I agreed. "I just want to make sure she's not taking on too much responsibility. You know how Grace is. She has trouble saying no when people need help." "She's certainly been very active in our building fund committee," Pastor Glenn said. "Derek Owens has been a tremendous help with the property assessments. He's donated so much of his time to the church." "Derek seems like a good man," I said carefully. "Grace speaks very highly of him." "They work well together," Pastor Glenn agreed. "It's nice to see new members getting so involved in church life." I left the meeting with Pastor Glenn thinking I was a concerned husband looking to strengthen his marriage through faith. In reality, I'd planted the first seeds of doubt. The next time someone mentioned seeing Grace and Derek together, Pastor Glenn would remember our conversation and start asking questions. My next stop was the Millbrook Coffee Cafe, where I knew I'd find Rita Santos holding court at her usual table near the register. Rita had owned the cafe for 15 years and had elevated gossip to an art form. She knew everyone's business and wasn't shy about sharing it with anyone who would listen. "Eddie Barrow," she called out as soon as I walked through the door. "I haven't seen you in ages. How's Grace?" "She's good," I said, ordering a black coffee and taking the empty chair at Rita's table. "Busy with church stuff, as usual." "That woman is a saint," Rita declared. "Always volunteering for something. Just yesterday, Sandy Mitchell was telling me how hard Grace has been working on the building fund." "Sandy was here yesterday?" "Oh, yes. Having coffee with that new real estate fellow, Derek something. They seemed to be having quite the intense conversation." I shook my head in apparent confusion. That's strange. Grace told me Derek was out of town yesterday, visiting family in Portland. Rita's eyes sharpened with interest. She smelled a story brewing. Are you sure? Because I definitely saw him here around 10:30. Grace must have gotten her dates mixed up, I said with a shrug. She's been so scattered lately with all these committee meetings. Rita said, clearly filing this information away for future use. Well, I'm sure it's nothing. You know how busy everyone gets with church business. I finished my coffee and left, confident that Rita would spend the rest of the day wondering about the discrepancy in Derek's whereabouts. By evening, she'd probably mentioned it to at least a dozen other people. The beauty of small-town gossip was that it spread like wildfire, growing and changing with each retelling. By the time the story made its way back to Grace, it would be completely out of control. That evening, Grace came home at her usual late hour, full of stories about the regional manager interviews and the dinner that followed. She was getting better at the lies, adding details that made them more believable. Under different circumstances, I might have been impressed by her creativity. How was your day? She asked, settling onto the couch next to me. Quiet, I said. Had coffee with Rita Santos this afternoon. She mentioned seeing Derek Owens in town yesterday. Grace's smile flickered for just a moment. Derek? I thought he was visiting his mother in Portland. That's what I told Rita, I said, watching Grace's face carefully. She must have been mistaken. Must have been, Grace agreed, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was wondering if Derek had lied to her about his whereabouts, or if someone had seen them together. Either way, doubt was creeping in, and doubt, in my experience, led to mistakes. I was counting on it. The first crack in Grace's facade appeared 3 days later. I was in my workshop when I heard her on the phone upstairs, her voice sharp with frustration. I don't care what Rita Santos thinks she saw, Grace was saying. We need to be more careful. I crept closer to the stairs, straining to hear the other side of the conversation. No, Eddie doesn't suspect anything, Grace continued, but people are starting to talk, and I can't afford to have rumors spreading around the church. There was a long pause. Then Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. I know you want to go public, Derek, but not yet. I need more time to figure out how to handle the divorce without losing everything. Divorce. The word hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. Grace wasn't just having an affair. She was planning to leave me. And from the sound of it, she was trying to figure out how to do it without giving me half of everything we'd built together. I'd underestimated her. Grace wasn't just unfaithful, she was calculating. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a midlife crisis. It was a carefully planned exit strategy. That changed everything. Over the next week, I escalated my campaign. I made sure to mention Derek's name in casual conversation whenever I was around church members, always in positive terms, but with just enough confusion about details to make people wonder. I started attending the men's breakfast on Saturday mornings, where I played the role of the concerned husband whose wife was working too hard for the church. Grace was out until almost midnight last night, I told the group one Saturday, shaking my head in apparent bewilderment. Something about reviewing property documents with Derek Owens. I keep telling her she needs to delegate more, but you know how dedicated she is. The men nodded sympathetically, but I could see the questions forming. Property documents at midnight? That seemed excessive, even for someone as dedicated as Grace. Meanwhile, Grace was becoming increasingly paranoid. She'd started taking her phone with her everywhere, even to the bathroom. She'd changed all her passwords and had become suspicious of my sudden interest in church activities. "Since when do you care about the men's breakfast?" she asked one Friday evening as I got ready for bed. "Since I realized I've been taking our church community for granted," I replied. "Pastor Glenn thinks it's important for married couples to share their faith journey." Grace's expression softened slightly. She'd always wanted me to be more involved in church, and despite everything, She still cared about keeping up appearances. "That's good," she said. "I'm glad you're making an effort." If only she knew how much effort I was really making. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, on a Thursday evening when Grace claimed to be working late on year-end HR reports. I knew she was lying because I'd driven past her office building at 7 o'clock and seen that her car wasn't in the parking lot. Instead of going home, I drove to Derek's apartment complex on the outskirts of town. His black BMW was parked in front of Building C, and Grace's Honda was right next to it. I sat in my truck for over an hour, watching the lit windows of Derek's second-floor apartment. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement, shadows passing in front of the curtains, the brief silhouette of two people embracing. At 10:30, Grace finally emerged from the building. Her hair was mussed, her lipstick was gone, and she was carrying her shoes in her hand. Derek appeared in the doorway wearing nothing but a bathrobe, pulling her close for one last kiss before she walked to her car. I followed her home, staying far enough back to avoid detection. Grace pulled into our driveway at exactly 11 o'clock, then sat in her car for 5 minutes, presumably fixing her appearance and preparing her story. When she finally came inside, she looked perfectly composed. "Sorry I'm so late," she said, kissing my cheek. "The HR reports were more complicated than I expected." "No problem," I said, not looking up from the television. "How much longer do you think the project will take?" "Another week or two," Grace replied. "Maybe longer if we run into complications." I nodded as if I believed her, but inside, I was done with games. It was time to bring everything into the open. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to Derek's office. I waited until I saw him leave for his usual coffee run, then approached his secretary, a young woman named Jennifer who looked barely old enough to vote. "I'm Eddie Barrow," I said, extending my hand. "My wife Grace works with Derek on some church committee business. I was hoping to surprise her with lunch, but I can't remember which restaurant they usually go to." Jennifer smiled brightly. "Oh, that's so sweet. They usually go to Romano's on Thursdays, but I think they're meeting at the Riverside Inn today. Derek mentioned something about wanting to try their new menu." The Riverside Inn was a small hotel and restaurant about 20 miles outside of town. It was the kind of place couples went when they wanted privacy. "Thank you," I said. "I'll head over there now." "I'm sure she'll be surprised," Jennifer said with a laugh. She had no idea how right she was. I arrived at the Riverside Inn at 12:30 and found Grace's car in the parking lot. Through the restaurant's windows, I could see her and Derek at a corner table, holding hands across the white tablecloth like honeymooners. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes, gathering my courage. Then I walked into the restaurant and straight to their table. "Grace," I said calmly, "fancy meeting you here." My wife's face went white. Derek looked confused, then embarrassed as he realized who I was. "Eddie," Grace stammered, "what are you doing here?" "I came to have lunch with my wife," I said, pulling out the empty chair and sitting down. "I hope you don't mind if I join you." Derek started to stand. "I should probably go—" "Sit down," I said, my voice still calm but carrying an edge that made him freeze. "We need to talk." The restaurant was quiet except for the soft murmur of other diners and the clink of silverware. Grace looked like she might be sick. "Eddie, I can explain—" "No need," I interrupted. "I know exactly what's going on. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Derek found his voice. "Look, Mr. Barrow, I never meant for this to happen. Grace and I, we just connected, you know? Sometimes these things don't just happen," I said, turning my attention to him. "They're choices, and choices have consequences." "Are you threatening me?" Derek asked, his confidence returning slightly. "I'm stating facts," I replied. "You're having an affair with a married woman. In a town like Millbrook, that kind of thing tends to become public knowledge pretty quickly." Grace leaned forward. "Eddie, please. Can we discuss this at home?" "We're discussing it now," I said. "All three of us. since we're all involved. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the photos I'd taken of them kissing in the parking lot of Derek's apartment building. "Nice pictures," I said, showing them the screen. "Very artistic. I'm sure Pastor Glenn would appreciate the composition." Derek's face flushed red. "You can't—" "I can do whatever I want," I said. "These are my wife, and my marriage you've been playing games with." Grace was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Eddie, I'm sorry. I never wanted you to find out like this." "How did you want me to find out?" I asked. "When you filed for divorce? When you moved in with Derek? When the whole town was talking about it behind my back?" "It's not like that," Grace whispered. "It's exactly like that," I said. "I heard you on the phone, Grace. You're planning to divorce me and take half of everything I've worked for. The only thing you're sorry about is getting caught." Derek cleared his throat. "Maybe we should all take some time to cool down." "You don't get to speak," I said without looking at him. "You lost that right when you decided to sleep with my wife." I stood up, dropping a $20 bill on the table. "Here's what's going to happen. Grace, you're going to come home with me right now, and we're going to have a real conversation about our marriage. Derek, you're going to stay away from my wife and start looking for a new town to practice your real estate business." "You can't make me leave," Derek said, standing as well. "Watch me," I replied. I walked out of the restaurant without looking back, knowing Grace would follow. She caught up with me in the parking lot, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "Eddie, wait," she called. "We need to talk about this rationally." "Rationally?" I turned to face her. "There's nothing rational about adultery, Grace. There's nothing rational about planning to divorce your husband while pretending to be a devoted Christian wife." "I never meant for it to go this far," she said. "But it did go this far. And now we all have to live with the consequences." I got in my truck and drove home, leaving Grace to follow in her own car. The confrontation had gone better than I'd expected, but I knew it was just the beginning. Grace and Derek would regroup, probably try to figure out how to manage the situation now that everything was out in the open. They had no idea what I had planned for them next. Grace didn't come home that night. She called around 8 o'clock to tell me she was staying at Sandy Mitchell's house to think things through. I wasn't surprised. Sandy had been enabling the affair from the beginning, so it made sense that Grace would run to her for support. What Grace didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. While she was planning her exit strategy, I'd been building my own. The next morning, I drove to Pastor Glenn's office for our regularly scheduled meeting about joining the men's ministry. He was waiting with coffee and a warm smile, completely unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down. "How are things at home?" he asked as we settled into our chairs. "You mentioned some concerns about your marriage last time we talked." "That's actually what I wanted to discuss," I said, pulling out a manila envelope. "I've discovered some things about Grace that I think you should know." Pastor Glenn's smile faded as I handed him the envelope. Inside were printed copies of Grace's text messages to Derek, hotel receipts, and the photos I'd taken of them together. I'd spent hours organizing everything into a clear, undeniable timeline of the affair. Pastor Glenn's face went through a series of emotions as he reviewed the evidence: confusion, disappointment, and finally, deep sadness. "Eddie, I'm so sorry," he said finally. "I had no idea." "Neither did I, until recently," I replied. "The thing is, Pastor, Grace has been using her position in the church to facilitate this relationship. She's been lying to you, to me, and to the entire congregation while presenting herself as a model Christian wife." "What do you want me to do?" Pastor Glenn asked. "I want the truth to come out," I said. "Grace has built her reputation on deception. The people who look up to her deserve to know who she really is." Pastor Glenn was quiet for a long time, studying the photos. "This is going to destroy her standing in the church," he said finally. "She destroyed it herself," I replied. "I'm just making sure people know the truth." "And Derek?" Derek Owens has been using his volunteer work as a cover for seducing married women. How many other wives has he targeted? How many other marriages has he helped destroy? Pastor Glenn nodded slowly. I'll need to speak with the church board about this, and I'll have to remove both Grace and Derek from their committee positions. I understand, I said. I just want you to know that I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm doing it because the church community deserves better than to be manipulated by people who don't share their values. I left the meeting knowing that word would spread quickly through the church hierarchy. By Sunday, everyone who mattered would know about Grace's affair. Her carefully constructed image would be in ruins. But I wasn't done yet. My next stop was Derek's office. I found him at his desk, looking haggard and worried. He'd probably spent the night trying to figure out how to minimize the damage from our confrontation at the restaurant. We need to talk, I said, closing the door behind me. Derek stood up, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. If you're here to threaten me again, I'm here to make you an offer, I interrupted. A way out of this mess that doesn't end with your business and reputation in ruins. Derek's expression shifted from defiance to curiosity. What kind of offer? Leave town, I said simply. Close your business, pack your things, and find somewhere else to practice real estate. Do it quietly, and I won't share what I know about your business practices with the Better Business Bureau or your former clients. What are you talking about? I pulled out another envelope, this one containing documentation of Derek's questionable business dealings. Inflated property assessments, hidden fees, and misleading contract terms. I've been doing some research, I said. Turns out you've been running the same scams here that you ran in Portland. The only difference is that Millbrook is small enough that word travels fast when people realize they've been cheated. Derek's face went pale as he flipped through the documents. How did you get these? I'm good at finding things, I said, and I'm even better at putting pieces together. You've got maybe a week before your former clients start comparing notes and filing complaints. This is blackmail, Derek said. This is business, I corrected. You have something I want, distance from my wife and my town. I have something you want, the ability to leave with your reputation somewhat intact. Derek sank into his chair, the fight going out of him. What about Grace? Grace is my problem, not yours, I said. Your problem is deciding whether you want to leave quietly or wait for the scandal to destroy everything you've worked for. I left Derek's office confident that he'd take my offer. Men like him were fundamentally cowards. They preyed on others when they felt safe, but they ran when confronted with real consequences. That afternoon, I received a call from Sandy Mitchell. Eddie, we need to talk, she said, her voice tight with anxiety. Grace is very upset, and I think you're being unreasonable. Where do you want to meet? I asked. The coffee shop, 1 hour. I arrived at Millbrook Coffee to find Sandy waiting at a corner table, her face flushed with righteous indignation. Grace wasn't with her, which was probably for the best. You can't do this to Grace, Sandy said before I'd even sat down. She made a mistake, but she doesn't deserve to have her life destroyed. She didn't make a mistake, I replied calmly. She made a series of calculated decisions over several months. There's a difference. She loves Derek, Sandy said. Sometimes people fall in love with the wrong person at the wrong time. That doesn't make them evil. No, but lying about it does. Using the church as a cover for adultery does. Planning to divorce me and take half of everything while pretending to be a devoted wife does. Sandy's expression shifted slightly. How did you... I know about your role in all of this, Sandy, I said. The coffee meetings with Derek, the schedule coordination, the alibis. You've been helping them deceive me from the beginning. I was trying to help my friend, Sandy said defensively. You were helping her destroy her marriage, I corrected, and now you're going to help her face the consequences. What do you want? Sandy asked. I want Grace to stop hiding behind other people and start taking responsibility for her choices, I said. And I want you to stop enabling her, She's scared, Eddie. She knows she made mistakes, but she's terrified of losing everything. She should have thought of that before she started sleeping with Derek Owens, I said. Actions have consequences, Sandy. It's time Grace learned that lesson. I left the coffee shop knowing that Sandy would report every word of our conversation back to Grace. Good. I wanted Grace to understand that I was serious about exposing the truth. That evening, Grace finally came home. She looked exhausted, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and worn. "We need to talk," she said, standing in the doorway of my workshop. "I'm listening," I replied, not looking up from the engine I was rebuilding. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be," Grace said. "But destroying my reputation won't fix our marriage." "Our marriage was destroyed the moment you decided to sleep with Derek Owens," I said. "I'm just making sure everyone knows who was responsible." "Eddie, please," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you, but we can work through this. We can go to counseling, we can get divorced," I interrupted. "That's what you wanted anyway, right? I'm just speeding up the process." Grace was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did hurt me," I said, finally looking at her. "You hurt me. You lied to me, and you made me look like a fool in front of the entire town. Now it's your turn to see how that feels." Grace left without another word. I heard her packing upstairs, then the sound of her car pulling out of the driveway. I knew she was going back to Sandy's house, probably to plan her next move. It didn't matter. I'd already made mine. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that seemed to match the mood hanging over Millbrook Methodist Church. I arrived early, taking my usual seat in the back pew where I could observe without being noticed. The church filled slowly, members of the congregation greeting each other with the polite smiles and hushed conversations that characterized our weekly gathering. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, the kind that came when everyone knew something was about to happen, but wasn't quite sure what. Grace arrived 15 minutes before the service began, flanked by Sandy Mitchell and 2 other women from her committee. She'd clearly spent time on her appearance. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless, and she wore a conservative navy dress that projected respectability and innocence. She was playing the role of the wronged wife, the victim of malicious rumors spread by a jealous husband. I had to admire her strategy, even as I prepared to destroy it. Derek Owens was notably absent, which didn't surprise me. He'd probably taken my advice and started making arrangements to leave town. Men like Derek were survivors first and lovers second. Pastor Glenn took the pulpit looking older than his years, the weight of what he knew clearly wearing on him. He began the service with a prayer for wisdom and forgiveness, his eyes briefly meeting mine across the crowded sanctuary. The sermon was about truth and consequences, drawn from the story of David and Bathsheba. Pastor Glenn spoke about the destructive power of deception and the importance of facing our sins with honesty and repentance. It was a masterful performance, addressing the situation without naming names or making direct accusations. But everyone in the church knew exactly what he was talking about. Grace sat rigid in her pew, her face a mask of composure that didn't quite hide the panic in her eyes. She could feel the weight of dozens of stares, the whispered conversations that stopped when she passed, the careful distance that people were already beginning to maintain. After the service, I watched from across the parking lot as Grace tried to maintain her normal routine of socializing and committee planning. But the conversations were shorter now, the smiles more forced, and several people found excuses to cut their interactions brief. Rita Santos approached me as I was getting into my truck. "Eddie," she said, her voice heavy with sympathy. "I heard about Grace and that real estate fellow. I'm so sorry." "Thank you," I replied. "It's been a difficult time." "If there's anything you need, someone to talk to, a meal, anything, you just let me know," Rita said. "The whole town is behind you." I nodded gratefully, though inside I was calculating how quickly the news would spread through Rita's extensive network of friends and customers. By evening, everyone in Millbrook would know that Grace Barrow had been caught cheating on her husband. That afternoon, I received a call from Derek Owens. "I'm leaving," he said without preamble. "I'll be gone by the end of the week." "Smart choice," I replied. "What about Grace? What about her?" "She thinks you two can work things out," Derek said. "She thinks this is all just a phase, that you'll forgive her eventually." "Grace thinks a lot of things that aren't true," I said. "That's part of her problem. She's going to be destroyed when she realizes you're serious about the divorce." "She destroyed herself," I said. "I'm just making sure she understands the consequences." Derek was quiet for a moment. "You're a cold bastard, Eddie Barrow." "I'm a man who keeps his promises," I replied. "And I promised to love and honor my wife until death do us part. She's the one who broke that promise." Derek hung up without another word. I never saw or heard from him again. Monday morning brought the final phase of my plan. I drove to Grace's office building and requested a meeting with her supervisor, Margaret Chen, the regional HR director. Margaret was a professional woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible workplace drama. She listened without comment as I presented my evidence of Grace's affair, focusing particularly on the lies Grace had told about working late and the way she'd used company time and resources to facilitate her relationship with Derek. "I'm not looking to cause trouble for Grace professionally," I said, "but I thought you should know that her claims about working overtime on HR reports weren't accurate. She was actually meeting with her boyfriend during those hours." Margaret studied the timeline I'd prepared, cross-referencing it with Grace's timesheets and overtime claims. "This is very serious," she said finally. "If Grace has been claiming overtime pay for hours she wasn't actually working, that's a form of fraud." "I figured you'd want to investigate," I said. "Grace has always been very concerned about professional ethics. I'm sure she'd want any discrepancies cleared up." I left the meeting knowing that Grace's professional life was about to become as complicated as her personal life. Margaret Chen wasn't the type to ignore potential fraud, especially when it involved false overtime claims. That evening, Grace came home in tears. She'd been suspended from work pending an investigation into her timesheets, and the church board had asked her to step down from all her committee positions. "They're treating me like a criminal," she sobbed, collapsing onto the living room couch. Margaret Chen went through my records with a fine-tooth comb, questioning every hour of overtime I've claimed in the past 6 months. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you started lying about where you were spending your time," I said. "This is about more than the affair, isn't it?" Grace asked, looking at me with red-rimmed eyes. "You're trying to destroy my entire life." "I'm trying to make sure the truth comes out," I replied. "You built your reputation on lies, Grace. Now people are seeing who you really are." "Derek's leaving town," she said. "Did you know that?" "I figured he would," I said. "Men like Derek don't stick around when things get complicated." Grace was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I loved him," she whispered. "No, you didn't," I said. "You loved the excitement, the attention, the feeling of getting away with something. But you didn't love Derek Owens. If you had, you would have divorced me first instead of trying to have it both ways." "What happens now?" Grace asked. "Now you face the consequences of your choices," I said. "You find a new job, a new church, maybe a new town. You start over and try to do better next time." "What about us?" "There is no us," I said. "There hasn't been for months. You just forgot to mention it." Grace left that night and didn't come back. Sandy Mitchell called the next day to tell me that Grace was moving to Portland to stay with her sister while she looked for a new job. The divorce papers arrived a week later, along with a letter from Grace's attorney requesting a 50-50 split of all marital assets. I laughed when I read the letter. Grace was still trying to get everything she wanted, even after being caught red-handed. Some people never learned. My attorney had a different perspective on the situation. Given Grace's adultery and the evidence I'd gathered, he was confident we could negotiate a much more favorable settlement. Grace's lies about working overtime had also created legal problems that weakened her position considerably. In the end, Grace got her divorce, but not much else. The house, the savings account, and most of our shared assets stayed with me. Grace moved to Portland with little more than her clothes and her car, starting over at age 38 with nothing to show for 12 years of marriage except a reputation that had followed her across the state. I heard through Rita Santos that Derek Owens had moved to Florida, where he was apparently trying to rebuild his real estate business under a slightly different name. Grace never followed him, which confirmed my suspicion that their relationship had been more about rebellion than romance. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was having coffee at Rita's cafe when Sandy Mitchell approached my table. She looked older, worn down by the scandal that had consumed her best friend. "I hope you're satisfied," she said, her voice bitter. "Grace lost everything because of you." "Grace lost everything because of Grace," I replied calmly. "I just made sure people knew the truth." "She made a mistake." "She made a choice," I interrupted. "A series of choices over several months, with your help. Now she's living with the consequences." Sandy stared at me for a moment, then shook her head and walked away. I watched her go, feeling nothing but mild satisfaction at having the last word. That evening, I sat in my workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had always brought me peace. The house was quiet without Grace's presence, but it wasn't lonely. It was calm, honest, free from the undercurrent of deception that had poisoned our marriage for months. I'd kept my promise to make Grace face the consequences of her choices. Her reputation was destroyed, her career was in ruins, and her lover had abandoned her when things got difficult. She was starting over with nothing, just as she'd planned to leave me with nothing. Some people might call it revenge. I called it justice. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Mrs. Patterson calling about a leaky faucet in her kitchen. "I'll be right over," I said, reaching for my toolbox. After all, I had a reputation to maintain, and unlike some people, I kept my promises.